Hello and welcome to GCV Analytics webinar. Today we're going to be talking about the health or life sciences sector. And I have along with me today Mark Wilson, biotech consultant from Strategic Technology Bioconsulting. Formerly, he worked with GSK. Mark has more than 20 years of experience in developing, licensing, and commercializing tech in the pharma industry. He worked as a senior director of technology licensing and seconding SR1 at GlaxoSmithKline. He was involved in creatively developing divestment projects and spin-outs as part of a three-person unit from 2012 to 2017. Before that, he held various positions at JSK. And his academic background, he holds a PhD, excuse me, he holds a PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Leeds, as well as an executive MBA from Columbia and London Business School, as well as various certifications that he's gone accumulating all over the years, and truly a man who never stops learning. Mark, delighted to have you on this webinar today.
It's a real pleasure to take part. Thank you.
Before we go more into detail on the life sciences sector, I would like to just briefly acquaint the audience with who we are and what we do. So we are Mawsonia, a global multimedia publishing company. We have three major publications: Global Corporate Venturing, which, as the name well suggests, deals with corporate venture capital, and that's our most famed publication. All of the data and news flow that goes into it becomes part of the GCV Analytics platform. Then we have the Global University Venturing publication, which deals with innovation coming from students and faculty members of various universities around the globe and how that unfolds. And we've also recently started our Global Impact Venturing publication, which deals more broadly with how corporations are trying to exert an impact, a social impact as defined by the UN's standards on development and sustainability. Aside from that, we also run the GCV Academy program, which is a training program for professionals that are trying to set up a CVC unit or a CVC investment program of some kind, which is led by Paul Morris, a true veteran in the CVC industry, who was the head of Dow Chemical Ventures for many, many years. And as part of our effort to bring together the entire CVC community, we also have the Global Corporate Venturing Leadership Society, which includes members from various CVCs around the globe, and come together as a community and as the voice of the corporate venturing industry. Now, many of the people who know us mainly from our events that we organize. Just recently, we had the GCV Symposium in London last month, and it was nice to catch up with Mark there, and along with 400 other corporate attendees that attended the symposium, and that accounted for about $2.5 trillion in annual corporate revenue, which, as it happens, is about the size of the UK's GDP. So it is one of our major events, and the other major event that we organize is the GCV Innovation Summit, which takes place in California at the end of January, more specifically in Monterey. In addition to that, we do some regional events, such as the ones that we've run in Brazil and Israel very recently. Our next two events are going to take place in first one is the GCV Synergy, which tries to connect CVCs with traditional VCs, and is going to take place in New York City on September 25th. And after that, we have the GCV Energy event taking place in Houston on November 20th and 21st. in the capital of oil and gas and energy and even healthcare in a way, if we think about it. Now, if any of you is interested in the data that we provide, the data we collect on corporate venturing, please do feel free to reach out to us and check us out at www.gcvanalytics.com. Our analytics platform is powered by Cubics, our partners at Cubics Analytics. And now that we're through with the marketing announcements, we could get into the interesting stuff about the healthcare sector. So before I dig into it, I'd like to remind the audience and the people who are attending right now with us that they could submit their questions on the control panel that appears on the right-hand side of their screen. Mark and I will try to answer the questions at the end, towards the end of the presentation and towards the end of the webinar, which we are going to try to keep reasonably short, within 40 minutes to an hour. So when we talk about the health or life sciences sector, the first thing to note is what do we mean by that? How do we define it? And the way we define it at GCV is fairly broad and encompasses things like pharmaceuticals, medical devices and diagnostics, healthcare, IT, as well as care provision and on-demand services and other related tech and services. Of course, the pharmaceutical element in the medical device element is probably the core element of this sector. And when we talk about pharma and pharma or medical devices, essentially we're talking about a business that is very slow and very costly. It takes at least 10 years on average for a drug to be brought to the marketplace, according to some data. The average cost associated with the successful launch of a drug are about the successful development and launch of a drug are about 2.6 billion. And here I also took the liberty to include this sort of table from a very recent study on trying to estimate clinical trial success rates. The study came out in April this year, so a fairly recent one. So what the study takes here into consideration is the first three phases from the FDA clinical trial path, and it calculates the overall probability for a new molecule to go through all those three phases to get approval, which is not, by the way, the end of the story, because it would have to go through phase 4, etc., before it actually becomes commercialized. But the phase 3 part is critical in the case of the FDA and in most regulatory bodies. The structure of the path is fairly similar. So the success rates do not seem exactly encouraging at first glance. It seems like the probability for a molecule to go from phase 1 through approval is about 6.9%. In other words, out of every 100 molecules that are out there, only about 7 get approved. And probably less of those get actually to be commercialized after all, because they would have to go through phase 4, which is essentially, can it be marketed for other, does it serve to treat other conditions, and so on. So I'd like to bring in Mark and his expertise here. So Mark, there's been a lot of talk about using emerging tech like AI or machine learning in order to speed up these processes in clinical trials, to rationalize them and streamline them. I'd like to ask, what are your observations on the issue? Has there been any progress, any tangible development in that area?
Yeah, thank you, Kaloyan. So it's an interesting question. It's a deeply challenging question for the industry. Typically, compounds take roughly 7 years in discovery and 7 years in development. The better companies will claim 12 as a total elapsed time. and for certain like express molecules, certain oncology molecules, perhaps that have been down to 8 to 9, but it's a long process. People are interested in exploring technologies both in the discovery space and in the development space. So in terms of discovery, we do see increasingly some fairly significant attempts to use AI to speed up the discovery process. Significant investment, significant activities, and I think at present the jury is out, but there certainly seems to be some possibilities in that area. In terms of clinical trials, in many ways, it's fairly clear what you have to do, and the aim is to get through as efficiently as possible. So the industry's probably gone through 10 or 15 years of really driving up the efficiency of its operations in clinical trials, in terms of making sure that all investigators are supplied, in terms of recruitment, driving down wastage in the supply process, and rationalizing the different countries where people conduct trial activities. Some feedback from the people connected to regulators is that adaptive trials are allowed in certain territories. The industry has been slow to embrace those, but perhaps there are possibilities. These trials actually enable you to move rapidly between the phases by having a pre-agreed protocol with the regulatory authorities. And we see a series of different technologies, in particular adherence, which we might return to later in the call. Adherence technologies are being now fairly routinely used in the trial process to try and understand the data that's coming back. So actually, overall, a fairly lively area. The opportunities for companies are perhaps, in some senses, moderate because you're going at a particular size of problem, but certainly a very good way to establish a technology, a very rich area, and we see actually quite a lot of activity.
I see. Could you briefly explain to our audience, in case there's anyone from outside this sector who may not know what you refer to in terms of adherence technology? Could you briefly define that, please?
Right, sure. So the statistics across different studies are fairly consistent, but somewhere between 30 to 50% of all people fail to take medications as they should. So it depends on the study. It varies to a degree, actually, with the medical condition concerned. But a very high percentage of medicines are not taken at the right time by the individual. So adherence, sometimes compliance, is an industry term, piece of jargon, really around trying to make sure that people take these very carefully developed, carefully manufactured medicines at the right time in order to see the therapeutic effect. The issue of those technologies is that it is, in some senses, moderately easy to persuade tech-savvy 30-year-old professionals to use an approach. It's a little bit harder to persuade the sort of proverbial little old lady, little old man, if I could put it that way, the retired person living alone and perhaps slightly confused about medicines, to actually take everything as he or she should. So actually, again, going back to the studies, many people, including most professionals, most people of a young age, fail to take the medicines correctly. And the data is really quite alarming. So a huge interest in adherence approaches. The issue with these really is, who will use these, and does this really help you address the totality of the population? And one of the great things I think about the way the pharma industry thinks about the world is they're very concerned with reaching that broad population. So that's the perspective they always bring to these debates with providers of technology.
Right, thank you. Moving along onto the more general trends in the sector, on which I'm going to need your input as well. So generally, the sector faces digitization and datafication disruption, much like most other sectors out there. And in a recent report, Deloitte identified a number of technologies with transformative potential for the life sciences, including AI, robotic automation, the Internet of Medical Things, software as a medical device, blockchain, DIY diagnostics, virtual care, genomics, and actually many other. So when we talk about going digital, inevitably we would have to touch on the issue of digital therapeutics. And it seems to be kind of an emerging field. The estimates of the global size of that market is about 1.82 billion for last year, but it's forecast to grow fairly rapidly within the next 5 or 6 years to about 7 billion, or just north of 7 billion. And digital therapeutic solutions do include anything from digital tracking and monitoring of patients to instilling, healthy habits and lifestyle sort of patterns. So it seems to me it does kind of touch on the adherence issue that you've so eloquently explained. So what is your take on developments in digital therapeutics, and what have been some of the trends that you've seen there? Would you please share that with us?
Sure. So I think, again, the big pharma perspective, and it's always useful to consider that on this domain, is that proof of these technologies has to be in the outcomes data. So can people show that there is a clear benefit from the application of these technologies? Do we actually achieve better healthcare outcomes for a patient population from use of these approaches? Clearly, again, that kind of mentality, we would like to see technologies that are rigorously developed and fully proven. So I think there are a number of technologies, a number of areas where we're beginning to see that. To me, digital therapeutics means essentially approaches such as those in cognitive behavioral therapy, where people can interact with digital systems, digitally mediated interactions, and actually there is a clear therapeutic benefit that can be shown. And in some of these situations, in psychiatric conditions, there appear to actually be benefits from having interactions through a digital domain at a distance, as it were. So I think there are circumstances where we see true benefit from digital therapeutics. That's a modest but a growing market. What we also see in terms of monitoring devices, I think, is increasingly much more rigor in terms of the data package people are preparing, much more rigor in terms of the development of those devices when they come to present those. So I think we see kind of a maturing of the sector. But the challenge, again, for me, from a pharma perspective, really is to sort of, please, could you demonstrate the outcomes data? Can we show this actually is having the therapeutic effect that we would all wish to see?
I see. So some time will definitely have to pass for us to see how that technology unfolds its potential. Now, when we talk about digitization, of course, it's inevitably we have to touch on the idea of medical devices and how medical devices are becoming smarter, where you see the human body essentially as a data source for the medical research or for drug research. So currently, according to data of various reports that I've been able to find, about 48%, or about half of all medical devices today are connected, and the expectation is about 68% of them will be connected 5 years from now. So we definitely see digitalization there. Now, the medical device industry has hit a record in terms of its revenues in 2018 at $379 billion. However, it must be noted that most of that growth that these companies registered was inorganic, and thanks to mergers and acquisitions. So it does seem like the medical device industry shares the same kind of difficulties and complexities that the pharma industry with long and costly R&D, long and costly regulatory approval paths, and so on. So the current environment of low interest rates, and relatively cheap capital does allow for this sort of inorganic growth here as well. Now, when we talk about trends in the sector, we inevitably have to touch on some of the shorter term issues. And according to recent surveys of pharma executives, drug pricing and reimbursement constraints will constitute the biggest kind of burden on the sector through the rest of the year. Although some of the respondents of the Global Data Pharma's survey did express certain optimism about China and opportunities for the industries in other markets. So we are yet to see what's going to happen. But Mark, you are consulting life sciences startups pretty much on a daily basis. So you do have a very good sort of observation as to what has been going on, even from the corporate perspective. So what is your take on the economic issues in the pharma industry for the, let's say, short to medium term kind of thing?
Yeah, so thank you, Kaloyan. I think a view is it's just a broad view across the industry, but I think there's always huge potential in these new oncology treatments, huge potential in cell and gene therapies, which are now actually finally, as it were, beginning to come to market. And so these are creating, I think, real pricing pressures. We see that particularly in the US, and I don't think that's going to go away. In fact, given the size of that market and the size of that broad oncology opportunity from a commercial perspective, I think that very much will remain centre stage. Obviously, speaking from the UK has a particular approach in terms of the NHS with the health technology assessment through NICE. And I think many countries around the world see that as a very good approach, as a very good way of trying to get to grips with this difficult issue of healthcare economics. So we see, very different things in different places. We see, if you like, a firm position in the UK and I think broad interest in many places in the world in that approach. And we see, I think, the situation as currently exists in the US continuing probably for the next 2 or 3 years, possibly longer. I think that will be an enduring issue.
I see. Would you please elaborate a bit on the UK's NICE approach? As NICE is actually an acronym in this case, but would you elaborate on that very briefly for people from our audience who may listen now or watch this webinar later?
Sure. The NICE, National Institute of Clinical Excellence, in essence, for the NHS, primarily for the NHS in England, given devolution in the UK, tries to conduct a cost-benefit assessment of the value of new healthcare technologies, so pharmaceuticals, medical devices, but other interventions as well. And in doing that, it has a fairly transparent process. There is significant input from the sponsor company. There is independent expertise sought typically from sophisticated academic groups to actually engage in some of the detail of the health economics. And it finally reaches a recommendation based on quality adjusted life years, on the value of the medicine, issues a recommendation, and there is scope for the company to appeal that. But it has a particular methodology which is quite well stipulated, and it continues to review that and consider how that could be adapted. Current issue really is how benefits to other parties beyond the patient, to carers, to society more broadly might be taken into consideration. So again, we see healthcare systems around the world, public healthcare systems, really trying to address significant issues in middle-income economies. Government healthcare systems are really pressured from both ends, because they often have some like low-income country issues, but they also have an explosion of oncology demand and issues with non-communicable diseases. So it's just a comment, again, different things are happening at different places in the world, and it's not in any way to say that the UK approach is the best, or the only good way, but certainly I think there is significant interest as people grapple with how do you deal with these issues of healthcare economics.
Right, thank you. And when we talk about general trends in pharma and in the life sciences sector, it's inevitable that we have to touch on oncology and cancer treatment. So this is a field that has experienced a significant transformation in recent years, with the rise of particularly of immuno-oncology. Currently, there are more than 700 cancer drugs in late-stage development, up 60% from just a decade ago. And global oncology therapeutics is expected to reach 200 billion in size by 2022, in just a couple of years. So at a pretty significant growth rate. Do you have any observations on the oncology and cancer treatment fields, and what are the most interesting trends there? Because cancer does seem to be, the continuing scourge of humanity as we speak. So it would be interesting for you if you could touch on that briefly.
Sure. So I think in this context, it's interesting sort of to stand back and look at the big picture. So across certainly developed world healthcare systems, we've actually been very effective at a sort of macro level in dealing with a whole series of health issues, in particular cardiovascular and other conditions. And that in many ways leaves cancer center stage, certainly one of the key conditions at center stage. We should benefit. We've really seen an explosion in scientific understanding around the whole field of oncology, and that is what is driving this whole set of developments. So that in many ways, again, standing back at a macro level, this is an absolute positive. We should relish this over the next generation. Hopefully we will truly with cancer, and we'll be able to stand back and kind of look at humanities and Western healthcare systems achievements in this regard. And now, right at the moment, what that does is that feeds directly into the sort of pricing pressures we were talking about in the US. And actually, it creates significant challenges in our world for pharmaceutical companies, for the venture groups. So as we move to more sophisticated science, to more sophisticated approaches, and perhaps a very, very large potential market impact, it becomes very incumbent on people to make extremely good decisions extremely rapidly about potentially very significant deals. So, for instance, GSK's acquisition of Zaro, there are kind of many other examples. So we see really, really interesting challenges, I think, for the industry in understanding how it can step through those, the positive problem, if you like, but those challenges, and actually then move through to the other end and deal with the pricing issues. But overall, if we stand back, this is exciting, this is a great thing that's happening, and notwithstanding all the difficulties, we should be very pleased that, again, as I say, the next generation will hopefully lead to great strides.
Right. Okay, so that kind of concludes our general observations on trends in the sector. Now we're going to dive into the corporate venturing side of things. So between May last year and April this year, we tracked 351 deals backed by life science corporations, a huge number of them based in the US or US-based startups. Now, despite this heavy weight of the US element here, Maud, I'd like you to briefly touch on the UK life sciences innovation landscape, because you're very, very familiar with it. And I think for our audience, wherever the person may be from, they might be very interested to hear about the UK.
Okay, so thank you. So, sat today in Cambridge, part of the southeast cluster in the UK. I mean, I think the UK is very fortunate that through maybe an accident of history. It's ended up with a very
Mm-hmm.
strong life sciences sector. Clearly, there are other major clusters in Europe, in particular in Switzerland, and clusters kind of help to develop themselves. So I think the UK cluster has a lot of strengths. Certainly, there is huge strength in depth. Having had major companies in the industry in the UK certainly has been a key part of developing that ecosystem. And we do see changes. We see potential EU exit affecting a number of subsectors. And I think it's very important for people in the UK to maintain a very international view. So this is a very international industry, and it's important to always be aware of what's going on elsewhere. Typically, the cluster in the UK is competing against other major clusters in the US, elsewhere in Europe. I think most of the people who've looked at the data, and Kaloyan, you may have a view, find that actually stage for stage, UK-based biotechs are developed with less funding, which is overall not that helpful, but nonetheless huge strength in depth in the sector, and I think that will broadly remain. But I do kind of encourage colleagues, and particularly anyone engaged in policy in the UK government, to take a very international view. It's great the UK has these strengths, but we have to look after them carefully.
Now, I wouldn't like to I wouldn't like to ask a politically incorrect question at the moment, but there is also the issue of a potential EU exit for the UK. So do you think some of those subsectors within life sciences might be affected adversely by this, or is it just too hard to say at this point, because we don't even know what the Brexit is actually going to look like?
So I don't want to be dragged too far into this, but a couple of comments. So I think we have seen that a couple of specific subsectors, in particular, I think the smallest of the CROs and sort of service organisations and regulatory support groups have been affected, and a lot of that work to a degree has moved inside the EU 27. So I think many people in the industry would accept that's something that has happened. How things develop, I think, very much depends on how the situation unfolds. And so, again, there are great strengths. Overall, there's a strong position, and I think we have to hope that people who are making important policy decisions try and make those decisions with great wisdom and good judgment.
I see. And now from the UK, going back to global corporate venturing. So we did see that most of the corporations from the life sciences sector did invest in deals backing life science startups, which is hardly surprising. Now, what is more interesting is the wider range of emerging life science enterprises that they have backed. And if we look at this spider diagram here on this slide, we do see that there's quite a few names of startups developing diabetes treatments, like Phase Bio, Omada, Summa Therapeutics. In addition to that, we have things like mobile apps for surgeons, like Gauss Surgical. We have microbiome treatments, Biome X, neuroscience, Magnolia Neurosciences, and even oncology diagnostics like Grail. So a very varied sort of picture that we have here. But the occurrence of diabetes treatments does pique one's curiosity. So, Mark, what are your observations on this particular area of life sciences on diabetes treatment? I know that diabetes is still a fairly serious issue in some emerging economies, for example. So, what is your take on this?
Yeah, so I think this is a major issue for healthcare systems in their totality in sort of higher income countries. Increasingly, as you say, it actually is a very major issue for those individuals trying to run and direct healthcare systems in middle-income countries. You see increasingly sort of so-called diseases of the developed world, if you like, so particularly these non-communicable diseases. So again, we have to turn to the science and hope that there are real advances, and maybe some of these clinical programs will bear fruit. We should all hope so. I think this is an area where apps and adherence approaches and monitoring approaches can be very useful, but again, the kind of scrutiny I think one should apply to those is there real evidence that in application, in use, so in a real world setting, a real world evidence setting, actually as used by patients, we can show the benefits that we need. So an interesting space, many different approaches, clearly many different technologies on the sort of monitoring diagnostic side. But again, we just think we have to be careful, and in particular, again, I go back to that question of to what extent of the patient population could we reach with this technology? It does not need to be 100%, right. but who does this benefit, and what is the scale of that uplift?
Right. Now moving along with the presentation, because I'm conscious a little bit of time. Now, if we do look at the evolution of investments of health corporates on a year-on-year basis, it did register an increase from 296 deals that we tracked in 2017 up to 328 deals last year. And in terms of the total dollar amounts in those deals, these are total dollar amounts. I'm just clarifying for the audience. These are total dollar amounts rather than just corporate money. The increase was even higher, from 9.4 billion to nearly 14 billion. So this does seem to suggest that while the investors' interest is increasing, the valuations of such startups seem to be increasing as well. And we're yet to see how that unfolds throughout the end of 2019, of course. Now, if we look at the top investors over the past year from the health sector, the top three, as you can see in terms of number of deals: Eli Lilly, Johnson & Johnson, and the American Merck, not to be confused with the Germany-based Merck, along with other very well-known corporate names in the pharma industry predominantly. If we look at the top corporate investors, including life science corporations and other corporations, we do see players like Alexandria Real Estate. We do see players like Alphabet and Fidelity. So pharma. The pharma players are not alone in the context of digitization. That is the main takeaway from this slide and from the data, I would say. In terms of what is the breakdown of the life sciences startups that are being backed by, whether it's by life science corporates or other corporates, we do see that the three huge chunks basically are either pharma or medical devices or healthcare IT. So those are the three major subsectors, and there are many subsets and fields within those, some of which we have already touched on with Mark. Now, if we look again at the variety of life science startups, we do see quite a few things popping up. We see neurodegenerative diseases here on this spider diagram are quite salient, and names like Cortexime, Arrakis, Alector. We do see, of course, cancer treatments such as Relay Therapeutics, Artios, Galera, NextCare. Also, even platforms for prescription of apps and devices like xHealth. Quite a varied landscape again. Now, I'd like to briefly ask Mark about his take on neurodegenerative diseases, If that's okay, if you could comment briefly on that, what are the trends? How far has the science advanced in that field, in your view, Mark?
Okay, so thank you, Kaloyan. Again, an interesting data on your previous slides on the growth of healthcare IT, which links back to our earlier discussion on digital approaches in life science very broadly. I think the sort of industry view, at least my sense of that, is that people are looking for clear advances in the underlying science around neurodegenerative diseases. I think in oncology it's very clear we've had that huge advances and continue to, on an almost daily or weekly basis, make scientific advances, and that process is happening and will continue, and that's we should delight in that. I think there is some sort of skepticism in the industry and a challenge, which I think is a good challenge, around the neurodegenerative space. Just has the fundamental science moved to the point where actually we can proceed and almost, if you like, dive into that drug development process. So others may have a much more expert view, but again, different individuals I've spoken to, I'd say that's the broad reflection. And certainly I know a number of experts who have a very strong view that actually there are still huge challenges in this area. So an interesting space to watch, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. In terms of the top deals that we did track, I'm not going to go into too much detail on each of them. I'm just going to briefly mention the first top three. Several Therapeutics, which was backed by Pfizer. It's a $350 million round. It develops. It develops treatments for disorders affecting the nervous system, so something that we just briefly mentioned and touched upon. 23andMe, it's the already quite famed, I would say, DNA testing service provider, which was backed by GlaxoSmithKline. It's $300 million round, and Grail, which is a cancer testing tool, which was backed by a pretty significant syndicate, including WuXi Pharma. Now, I'm not going to go into detail further on any of those deals. You could read more details on them on our website, in our latest magazine. In addition to deals, we also try to track exits that involve corporations, whether as exiting ones or as acquirers. So for the health sector, we did track 54 exits last year, between May last year and April this year, and quite a few of them were IPOs, so 33 IPOs and 17 acquisitions. So IPOs do seem to be increasingly a financing and funding tool that's more and more used by corporate-backed startups in this life sciences sector. And if we look at the data actually on a year-on-year basis, again, we had 54 exits for the whole of 2018, and 36 of them were IPOs. So we do see the evolution that IPOs seem to be an interesting funding tool, or at least it seems to have been over the past 4 or 5 years. And given the complexities of the pharma industry, which we discussed earlier in this presentation, I think it's hardly surprising. But I'd like to ask Mark, what is your take on the slight explosion of IPOs that we see in the life sciences or biotech space?
Yes, hi. So I think if you look back over sort of 15, 20 years, the prevalence of IPOs maybe doesn't have a lot much to do with the biotech and VC community. I guess my view, probably sounds a strong statement, but I think my view is this really depends on US public market conditions and the views of the key stakeholders, the pension funds and so on, in that arena. And so it's very much a question of whether there's a draw into that market of the product that the venture capitalists and the biotech entrepreneurs continue to develop, regardless of market conditions. So I think this is something that is really interesting. It's absolutely relevant to our world, but I think this is something that collectively we have very little control over.
Right. Now, moving along to funding initiatives, I'm just going to mention very briefly that in terms of overall corporate-backed funding initiatives, whether it's regular VC funds where you have corporate LPs or newly launched CVCs from the sector or incubators, accelerators, etc. We didn't see that much change in terms of the number of initiatives. We did see a bit of an increase in the dollar amounts, as the slide shows. If we look at the top funding initiatives in the sector, the top three are actually already established investors recapitalizing their units. So the insurance company Allianz allocated more capital, over 1 billion euros in capital to its Allianz X, which invests, among other things, also in health and health-related technologies. Verily, which is the life sciences venturing division of Alphabet or Google, was also supplied with additional $1 billion, and Pfizer Ventures also got recapitalized with $600 million, so equivalent. However, Mark, when you were on our GCV symposium, you did lead a panel on funding trends in the life sciences sector, and it was a very interesting panel about those trends. So I'd like you to briefly summarize some of the points that you made on that panel, please, for our audience.
Sure, no, that'll be fine. So thank you. That was a great panel. It was real fun. The focus really was on hybrid funds. So where we were seeing either public capital with independent venture capitalists and those groups working together, or where we were seeing, and it's a particular interest of mine, the large pharma companies placing money under effectively some degrees of cooperative management with the major independent life science venture groups. And the pitch we made to the audience at the event was that actually there is a clear trend that something is happening in that space, that the number of schemes and cash that is being invested by those groups shows a pretty clear increase over the last 5 to 10 years. So I think it's a really interesting space. We seem to see people experimenting with different funding models for vehicles. I think that trend goes more broadly. EIF kindly came and commented on the panel around some of the schemes they're operating. And I think if you look on your earlier slides around the number of accelerators, incubators, the extent of funding that they're taking, we see a series of different approaches being used. So I think this is a trend. I think there is greater cooperation and greater joint management, greater degree of joint management between large pharma companies and independent VCs. And I think we see across the industry people experimenting with new structures and being willing to adapt models that probably served us well since the late 50s in California, but perhaps they also could be amended and adapted for the modern world.
All right, thank you. And finally, I'd like to briefly touch on the issue of university venturing. So we do see quite a bit of deal flow in university spin-outs from the life sciences sector, and it seems to have gone up on a year-on-year basis, as this very last slide of mine here shows. Now, you are very well versed in terms of things like licensing and commercializing. So what are your observations about new things, brand new things coming out of academia?
So I think this is a really interesting space, and we seem to see a similar trend in the US and the UK. Perhaps don't see that trend other places, or at least not to the same degree. So particularly in life sciences, it clearly is very difficult to assess technologies at a very early stage of development. And so wherever possible, it's the benefit of the institution to progress those through development. And that quickly becomes very expensive. So we see a number of funds moving into this space. We see quite rapid growth. And again, we see experimentation with structures, cooperation between universities in the southeast of England, Imperial, Cambridge, and some of the pharma companies, J&J, GSK. So we see different structures emerging, and I think quite rapid growth. So overall, I think this is very positive. And again, at a European level, if I could take that step back, perhaps we could, across the continent, exploit this approach more. But obviously, there needs to be care in doing that. People need to be very professional in the way they make the investments, professional in the way they broker the arrangements. But overall, I think this is a very valuable and a very interesting trend. And I suspect that we will see this continuing in the coming years.
Hopefully, and absolutely, it's a great and very exciting space. And now that kind of concludes my presentation. Now I do see there is one question that we have received from the audience from Susan Coster, who's asking, why do competing pharmaceutical firms co-invest in the same venture? How are the strategic benefits shared once the venture successfully developed the technology? Now, Mark, would you like to share your observation? Would you like me to give my perspective first on this question?
You're very welcome to respond, Kaloyan. I think Andonov will make some comment.
Sure. Well, in my observation from the data that I've analyzed on this sector over the past couple of years is actually pharmaceutical players do not often co-invest with each other. They are pretty open to co-invest with other corporate players from other industries, but they are rarely, if ever, that willing to co-invest with one another. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm just saying it's definitely not the rule. And I think part of that just inherently has to do with the sort of complexity of the industry and the internal challenges of the industry that we've already touched upon. Now, do they co-invest with in venture funds and traditional venture funds as LPs? We sometimes do see examples of that. And how are the strategic benefits shared once the venture is successfully developed? I would suppose that that is just to be determined on a case-by-case basis. I'm not sure if there is a specific formula or a specific set of rules being followed or a specific kind of unwritten rules of the game here. That's personally my observation. But Mark, if you would like to add anything, you're more than welcome. Obviously, you're much more versed on the sector than I am. So.
Thanks. But I think life sciences, I think pharma biotech are different to other fields of corporate venturing in a number of ways. And one of those is that broadly speaking, groups are very happy to co-invest, and it very much depends on the opportunity. I have heard the view from the entrepreneur's side that actually maybe having more than one corporate group actually is reassuring. In the sense that there could be no undue influence from one corporate group. But most people I've spoken to who've been involved in situations where there's corporate investment have been extremely positive about the involvement of the corporate group and professionalism. But co-investment does happen. Not all groups, not all venture groups are purely focused on direct strategic benefit. So some have a financial orientation, some have a mixed financial and strategic orientation. And I think, again, you have to occasionally take a step back. What a lot of the large companies get from having these groups is having super sharp professionals who are engaged in absolutely exquisite high-level networks. And they are extraordinarily useful for the corporation in identifying trends that are only just beginning to occur. So typically several years ahead or a few years ahead of those trends perhaps being picked up by the corporate R&D groups. So I think the co-investment does happen. I think this is a unique factor or a distinguishing factor of pharma and biotech. I think that's actually in many ways very positive. What happens at the time of a later deal of an exit very much depends on the situation with the organizations at that time. Again, people typically don't take privileged rights, and this is something maybe changing with the funds we're talking about, hybrid funds, but in general, people have no option rights. And so there is a straight auction, and I think again, my view is that the corporate people who typically have a BD background will be pushing very hard for the best possible price for the investment. So I think there are a whole series of things going on here, and this actually is not as strange as it might at first appear.
Right. Well, thank you for adding in those details. The other question that I see we have submitted from Professor Martin Hammick. How is Asia's technology capabilities and hotbeds in drug development versus medtech that are being developed by startups? Mark, do you have any particular observations on the Asian space?
So I didn't quite catch the question. There's a question around hot areas and are they Asian involvement in particular?
Yeah, so the way I interpret this question is how is it how does Asia compare in terms of drug development versus medtech, in terms of the emerging technologies and what we see in the innovation landscape there? I think that's how I interpret the question, at least.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so I think in terms of like classical biotech, pharmaceuticals, the large, mainly US and European companies have for quite a while been really interested to find pockets of truly novel and high quality science, and for a long while have been expecting to see that in a number of different places. And I think that is happening, but that perhaps hasn't happened at quite the speed that people had anticipated maybe 5 to 10 years ago, and I'm sure will happen. So I think where Asia has great strength is clearly around this integration of technologies, things that are IT-led. And so in terms of medtech or healthcare IT, then I think there are great possibilities. I think what we've actually maybe seen is that in classical biotech and pharma, if I can put it that way, that the deep infrastructures we've created in Europe and the US have been very helpful to date. But again, we would expect that to change reasonably rapidly in the coming years. But again, it's very, very difficult to understand exactly how that will move and how quickly. So a fairly general view, I apologize, but there we are, as kind of a perspective.
Right. No, it's a very legitimate perspective. And an additional question from Professor Hammick as well. As a medtech startup, how do I enter China and India, and what precaution do they have to take to consider and what precaution do they have to consider for not being copied immediately? How to go about dealing with manufacturing in China and India as a US or European startup? Do you have, because you do consult quite a few startups, do you have any sort of experience, any sort of touch with any startups trying to expand into the Chinese or the Indian market in your practice?
So I mean, I think the issue of, if you like, copying or IP infringement is a very difficult one. General advice on those territories is to engage with local stakeholders, potentially go in through partners. Clearly, a number of Western organizations have managed to very effectively implement manufacturing in China. That's one specific aspect. So I'm probably not best placed to answer this broader question around market entry. There are real challenges. This is clear.
Yeah, indeed, there must be quite a few challenges. I admit that I'm probably not quite versed myself to answer that question more in more detail. But I do assume the IP issue, as Mark pointed out, is quite significant. And there's probably other issues related to navigating the regulatory waters in a market like China or like India, which may further complicate things. That is my personal assumption there. However, yeah.
Sorry, to dive in, Kaloyan. I mean, I guess the one of the comments worth making is that in terms of these markets, I think it is worthwhile companies thinking differently, if you like, thinking about their products differently. So what is required in these markets is not necessarily what will have been developed for registration in the US or the UK. Been major interest in the pharmaceutical world over the last 10 years around could people produce kind of single dose packs? Could people produce kind of more unit driven means of providing medication? And I think that just shows that in terms of entering these very the markets are very different to the UK, the US. You really do have to think through the whole problem, and that includes what the product is and is it appropriate for that market? How maybe does it need to be adapted?
Right. So there's a whole range of other issues. Now I'm conscious of time, and we will try to finish very shortly. But I know that currently you are consulting quite a few life sciences startups. So I'd like you to take the opportunity to take a minute and briefly acquaint the audience as to what you do in advising those life sciences startups on various challenges that they may be facing on their way to success. So please do before I close this webinar.
Great, thank you. So my technical background is in preclinical development, and in particular strengths in drug delivery. That kind of involved a lot of work in technology strategy and understanding how GSK could and should be developing and commercializing different technologies. So I tend to get involved with companies that have things in early or mid stages of development, particularly where there's a platform technology of some type, and advise on how to shape that package and then get that introduced to the relevant parties in order to progress the exploitation of that approach. In terms of drug delivery, clearly the key interest at the moment is in cell and gene therapy, and so my activities have been led in that direction. But I guess what I really enjoy doing is engaging with people when they have great and promising technologies that helping them shape those packages and get them in front of the relevant individuals. So it's a good and rewarding way of working.
Great. Well, it's been a real pleasure having you on this webinar, Mark. Thank you very much for participating in it, and for the people who managed to join in live. Thank you very much. Stay tuned for our next webinar, which is going to be most likely during the 3rd week of July, and it's going to touch on the IT sector. We haven't decided on the date yet, so do stay tuned. Thanks once again to Mark and to all attendees attending live. Have a good day, night, or afternoon, wherever you may be in the world. Goodbye.